Hi, everybody. How are you? We're here in Brookline, Massachusetts. I'm so glad to see you all.
Long time no see.
Long time no see. We're talking about Robert Lowell's poem, For the Union Dead. It was written in 1960, and it was written just too late to go into, just after Life Studies, which is published in '59. And it became the title poem in the next book. It's a longer than the poems that we use in ModPo typically. So I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'm going to identify a section at a time, and we'll talk about those sections. For the Union Dead. The old South Boston Aquarium stands in a Sahara of snow now. Its broken windows are boarded. The bronze weather-vane cod has lost half its scales. The airy tanks are dry. Once my nose crawled like a snail on the glass. My hand tingled to burst the bubbles drifting from the noses of the crowd, compliant fish. My hand draws back. I often sigh still for the dark, downward, and vegetating kingdom of the fish and reptile. One morning last March, I pressed against the new barbed and galvanized fence on the Boston Common. Behind their cage, yellow dinosaur steam shovels were grunting as they cropped up tons of mush and grass to gouge their underworld garage. Parking spaces luxuriate like civic sand piles in the heart of Boston. A girdle of orange, Puritan pumpkin-colored girders braces the tingling State House, shaking over the excavations as it faces Colonel Shaw and his bell-cheeked Negro infantry on St. Gaudens, shaking Civil War relief, propped by a plank splint against the garage's earthquake. 2 months after marching through Boston, half the regiment was dead. At the dedication, William James could almost hear the bronze Negroes breathe. Their monument sticks like a fishbone in the city's throat. Its colonel is as lean as a compass needle. He has an angry, wren-like vigilance, a greyhound's gentle tautness. He seems to wince at pleasure and suffocate for privacy. He is out of bounds now. He rejoices in man's lovely, peculiar power to choose life and die. When he leads his black soldiers to death, he cannot bend his back. On a thousand small town New England greens, the old white churches hold their air of sparse, sincere rebellion. Frayed flags quilt the graveyards of the Grand Army of the Republic. The stone statues of the abstract Union soldier grow slimmer and younger each year, wasp-waisted. They doze over muskets and muse through their sideburns. The next stanza has the N-word in it, and I don't use the N-word, so I'm just going to say N-word, but it's written there on the page. Shaw's father wanted no monument except the ditch where his son's body was thrown and lost with his, it doesn't do the job, but N-word. The ditch is nearer. There are no statues for the last war here. On Boylston Street, a commercial photograph shows Hiroshima boiling over a Mosler Safe, the rock of ages that survived the blast. Space is nearer. When I crouch to my television set, the drained faces of Negro school children rise like balloons. Colonel Shaw is riding on his bubble. He waits for the blessed break. The aquarium is gone. Everywhere, giant finned cars nose forward like fish. A savage servility slides by on grease. Okay, so the first section we're going to talk about is the first 2 stanzas plus a little of the third. I'll read it quickly, and then I invite your comments. I think first we want to know what's happening. Where is he? What time? How's it working? The old South Boston Aquarium stands in a Sahara of snow now. Its broken windows are boarded. The bronze weather-vane cod has lost half its scales. The airy tanks are dry. Once my nose crawled like a snail on the glass. My hand tingled to burst the bubbles drifting from the noses of the cowed, compliant fish. My hand draws back. I often sigh still for the dark downward and vegetating kingdom of the fish and reptile. So we're going to stop there. It's as if a scene. And I would like Melissa to say first, sorry to cold call you, where are we, what time, who's speaking, any of those things.
Oh, I think there are people in this room, particularly this contingent, who knows more about the
South Boston
time period and when this was happening. But what happened is there was an old aquarium, and he's describing when it was torn down and the statue, the monument that was there, right? Or
I never knew about the South Boston Aquarium, so we have the New England one now, and I meant to look it up, and I'm not aware of this, so I...
Well, what do you know from the poem?
Oh, where we are.
Where are we?
Oh, in Boston.
He's in Boston.
Yes, we got that.
It's winter.
Yeah, it's winter. How do you know it's winter?
The Sahara of snow now.
Yep, now.
Which is an incredible phrase, I think, Sahara of snow now.
So why would you go to an old broken down aquarium in the winter?
Well, he's on some kind of a journey. I don't know what he's doing yet, but he's...
To build it, they had to remove the monument, or displace the monument.
Not the aquarium.
No,
you're reading ahead.
Yeah.
What's this scene here?
Well, I mean, the way he describes, the weather vane cod has lost half its scales, the airy tanks are dry. He's talking about a Sahara of snow in Boston. Like, that's just kind of an unusual thing to do, you know, but the airy tanks are dry. I think that the visuals for me are astounding here. Once my nose crawled like a snail on the glass as a child, seeing himself at the aquarium looking at the glass.
You guys are such good ModPo close readers. I'm asking something even more basic than that. Never apologize. Never apologize for going deep. Okay, where are we, and what is the time signature? Where are we? We're at the old aquarium. It's boarded up. When?
You said 1960, right? That's when the poem was written.
When, meaning now, the present of the poem?
So I think the aquarium was shut down in the late 40s, and it stood there as a house. It was like housing for homeless people.
So he's revisiting.
Yes, he is.
Yeah. He's like going back to a spot. And why would he go back?
Because maybe he grew up there.
Well, we know something from the next stanza.
Yeah.
As a child,
He's longing.
Exactly.
He's longing. I think there's a longing here.
What did he do as a kid?
It's nostalgia.
He's nostalgic.
Yeah.
What did he do? What did he do when he went there?
Well, his hands on the glass. Yeah. Looked at the fish.
Didn't we all? I think he put his nose. Didn't he put his nose?
He did. He crawled like a snail on the glass.
So
The cowed compliant fish.
he's a little kid. Your dating helps us, Nancy, because so he grew up and in the 30s, 40s, and he goes to so he's going back to something of his childhood. So narratively, it's complicated. The first stanza is something of the present. We don't know if it's the exact present of the poem, but it's now, the word now. Right? Then once, next stanza, once he remembers. Okay, there's another shift though. Does anybody see it? So we've got present, then we've got childhood past, and then?
My hand draws back.
That's present tense, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that remembered present from when he was a kid, or is that now?
Now.
My hand draws back. So he's gone to the old aquarium. He's doing what he used to do. And then he draws back again in the present. And then help me understand the time of this. I often sigh still.
For the dark downward and vegetating kingdom.
Why does he do that?
He's nostalgic still, like wanting that to be like it used to be.
Yeah, sighing is this.
The fish, seeing the fish, and
He sighs because...
he's nostalgic. He's sad.
For what, though? For what?
For what
was.
used to be.
For the dark downward and
For the
vegetating
name of aquarium.
Is he nostalgic for the happy clownfish? By the way, I don't know if clownfish are actually happy, but happy clownfish and, porpoises that would play ball with you. No, what is he? But look, what's the image? Is it a happy image?
It's almost like a limbic image.
Yeah.
Dark.
Yeah.
It's a what?
Dark.
Limbic, very, yeah.
He's sighing for the dark, downward. These are not positive terms. Dark, downward, vegetating kingdom of fish and reptiles.
There's actually
Yeah.
something restful in that too. I know it might sound antithetical,
Marble.
but
Yep.
Well, let's riff a little bit. Let's remember when we were kids and we pressed our nose to the glass. What was it we were trying to do at the zoo or the aquarium when you looked that intently? What were you trying to do?
Communicate.
Communicate? Wow, you were pretty sophisticated.
imagine,
Oh, imagine what?
imagine with that creature or being with that.
With that creature, with the consciousness that you had as a child,
yeah.
like
Well, and actually, an innocence. Right? There's an innocence with that.
Get as close as you can.
My hand tingled to burst the bubbles. What bubbles?
In the tank inside.
Created how?
By the fish.
The breathing of the fish.
the
Oh,
cows
so
and
the bubbles are
lions.
coming out of the noses and snouts of the fish. And he longed to get in there and burst the bubbles. I mean, all kids want to bust
Yeah,
bubbles.
sure.
Okay. All right.
And you want to get with the
So,
reptiles.
how you feeling about the opening section? We're revisiting an old. It sounds kind of like a poetic gesture. We're going back to an old ruin. Lots of poets start that way. Do you have a sense of the speaker, the I? So far, do you have a sense of the speaker?
I think very strong.
What's that?
Very strongly, right?
You think this person is strong?
I think that it's a strong view.
A strong view, yeah.
Yes.
It's the possessive. He's using my rather than I.
Where does he use my?
Couple
My
times.
hand draws
Right.
back.
My hand. My
My
hand.
nose, my nose, my hand.
My nose.
Also, he likes to recall the past.
He's thinking about the past. Okay, so now the next section, and this is a rough, people don't read poems this way, but we're just sort of portioning it out. The next section starts with One Morning Last March, which is a different time, and ends with the garage's earthquake. So this is all about what's happening in the Boston Common. Now, you folks have lived through how many big digs? No, really, it's a real question. How many
When
big
it went on for
three?
a decade.
Is it three? Have there been 3 big digs? Or 2?
We call them dig big.
So for people who are watching this discussion and not at all aware what these big digs, what is it about Boston and the big digs?
Well, the most
Is it
recent
corruption and it takes too long? Or
Yeah.
some of that.
what is it?
Boston's never happy with itself. It always wants to be something that it isn't.
Okay, that's a beautiful and abstract way of putting this, and I appreciate that. But what's the basic? What is the big dig? What is it?
It's a money pit.
You guys are still editorializing. Someone give me a dictionary definition of the big
The
dig.
city is restructured.
Multi-year infrastructure project.
A multi-year infrastructure. Is it about water? Well, this is about parking garages.
This is about garage.
Digging things up. It's
This is not the big
dig
improvement,
he's talking
the
about
improvement of the
This
city.
is not
right?
the big dig.
And development. I mean,
He's not talking about the
He
big
thought
dig,
this
it's
was
different.
pretty big.
This
Yeah.
was to him. Imagine if
Why
you saw
would
what
you
happened.
dig up historical fill Boston Common to build parking.
Exactly.
Why? I'm asking a question. You said exactly, as if it's some kind of rhetorical. Why the hell would they do it?
As a newcomer, there's no parking in Boston. It's hard to get around, and there's no
even 40 years ago.
corridor of transit. There's money in it.
Does anybody see the point of view? I'm sure most people in the room. Either his, we're going to discover Lowell's point of view, or the speaker's point of view, but your point of view. Does anybody share the point of view? You know, we should really not build parking if it means tearing up the Boston Common for 5 years and closing off historical statues and shaking the State House. I think the State House is shaking from all the digging. This is not good for an old city, right?
Well, I think that's the Boston Common Garage, which is still
Yes.
there and used all the time.
Right.
So it's
Yeah, it's been
there's no other place to put it.
fucking very useful.
He's there. She said it.
Let the record show that
The F-bomb for the first time tonight.
Harvard professor
Oh, I missed it.
and the onlyest begetter of the great poetry in America, series of online resources about poetry, which I highly recommend, by the way. Let the record show that she has a strong view of parking in Boston. All right, I'm going to read the section. I think we've done the work already, but I'm going to read it because I want us to talk about what Lowell is doing with his diction and his word choice, because he's got a strong view of this. And it's not the view of whatever we need to do to get the parking, let's do it. One morning last March, so there's a time change, right? One morning last March, I pressed against, we've seen that before, right? Pressed against. So, yeah. So once again, he's back doing that. I pressed against the new barbed and galvanized fence, not the aquarium, but it's also something shut down, like the old aquarium, on the Boston Common. Behind their cage, yellow dinosaur steam shovels, that's comic, were grunting as they cropped up tons of mush and grass to gouge their underworld garage. Parking spaces luxuriate like civic sand piles in the heart of Boston. A girdle of orange, Puritan pumpkin, more comedy, colored girders braces the tingling State House, shaking over the excavations as it faces Colonel Shaw and his bell-cheeked Negro infantry on St. Gaudens' shaking Civil War relief. Everything's shaking. Propped by a plank splint, by a plank splint. Plank is modifying splint. By a plank splint against, or maybe splint is a verb, I don't know, against the garage's earthquake. That's the section. Who wants to say something about it? What's happening? Anna, what's happening?
I think he is drawing this comparison between the feeling of going to the old aquarium and seeing this like desolate, abandoned space, and now looking at the excavation of what was a very used, much beloved space.
The Boston Common?
The Boston Common, and feeling maybe a little ambivalent about how the city is using resources, how the city is using public space. This is an infrastructure poem. And I thought the yellow dinosaur steam shovels was a great callback to the kid logic of like his like runny nose against the grimy kid runny nose.
Assuming it was a runny nose.
Yeah. Well, it's a snail. I mean, I can only make one conclusion.
Good point. So
It's kitsch. It's Boston kitsch.
Boston kitsch. I mean, orange Puritan pumpkin colored girders.
Oh my God.
But he's also talking, he's a little offended aesthetically, right? I mean, he thinks about Boston as the Boston of the Lowells, all the Lowells, right? And this is the Boston, there was I'm sure that no Lowell ever owned a sport jacket that was orange Puritan pumpkin colored. And yet here is downtown Boston, the common, capital C common. And then at the end of this section, he introduces Colonel Shaw. Doesn't identify Robert Gould Shaw by name. Doesn't identify him as really like Lowell, born into a prominent Boston family.
And intermarried with the Lowells.
And intermarried. So Shaw and Lowell, might as well be the same family.
Same.
Right?
Yeah.
So he introduces Colonel Shaw way into this poem. I think a lesser poet would have started and said, this is a civil rights poem. This is about the statue of Colonel Shaw and what, by the way, is happening to the statue during the dig. What's happening to it?
It's shaking and it's being propped by a board, basically.
And what else? It's not accessible. I think it's behind the lines. I think we learned that a little later.
It's being treated with disrespect.
It's the history, and what particular history, Lisa knew? What particular important history of Boston is being ignored by the city fathers?
It's abolitionist history, which had its own hypocrisies.
Yeah,
That's what,
that one.
that one.
So Shaw, the Boston Shaws of that time were a prominent abolitionist family, and Dad and young Robert kind of worked together to get a commission, which Robert first refused or resisted, but then eventually a so-called Negro infantry, a unit of black soldiers. So Shaw led this group, and many of them were slaughtered, and he himself was killed. So this is the thing that Lowell, the speaker anyway, is identifying as threatened by the building of parking garages. So he's got the problem stated by this point, and he keeps going back to his own childhood, which I think is important. All right, the next section is really, as far as I can tell, just the next 4 lines. It stands by itself. 2 months after marching through Boston, half the regiment was dead. Now he switches after a semicolon another time. At the dedication, William James could almost hear the bronze Negroes breathe. Okay, lots of history is being covered. Yeah. Somebody explain. Edith, you got this?
Okay, so 2 months after, so during the Civil War, there's a lot of time happening.
Yes,
so
it's very confusing, isn't it? Let's count the number of times we have so far. We have Lowell's boyhood. He was a freshman in college in 1935, so I'm guessing it's like the late 1920s or early 30s. Then?
Present 1960, past his childhood 35. Again, the present.
And also last March.
For the excavations. And
right.
last March, spring. And now he's going back to the Civil War.
And then
he's
forward.
But then he's referencing Gaudin's thing, which was 1896.
And it was dedicated in 1897. And William James, professor of, was he actually psychology? I think
Yes.
a psychology professor at Harvard was there and made a comment.
Right.
Okay, so lots of history. All right, now we move on to the next section, which is going to be the next 3 stanzas. I'll read it, you comment. Their monument sticks like a fishbone in the city's throat. Its kernel is as lean as a compass needle. He has an angry wren-like vigilance, a greyhound's gentle tautness. He seems to wince at pleasure and suffocate for privacy. He is out of bounds now. He rejoices in man's lovely, peculiar power to choose life and die. When he leads his black soldiers to death, he cannot bend his back. Okay, what's being said? Lots.
Yeah. Wow.
Helen?
Well, that was such a tough line to read, that the monument sticks like a fishbone in the city's throat. Just the choice.
Refers to maybe Boston not being so unequivocal about civil rights?
Yeah, I mean.
That was
it's-
a funny way of putting it.
Okay, yeah, I mean.
What
just
is this history of Boston and civil rights and busing and so forth?
Yeah, I was living out west during busing, so I didn't experience that firsthand, but I know about what happened then. And but I think the Fishbone for me, because he's talking about the cod earlier, and the cod is the symbol of Massachusetts, and so I mean, just what a right-on kind of.
Yeah, it's allusion to the aquarium. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, the cod is everywhere. I think it's in the State House. I think there's a huge cod in the State House. It's kind of our fish, you know. And
So now the cod, which is the very symbol of the region, is and also harkens back to his happy childhood with the aquarium that's now also been taken down.
right.
Now that sticks in
The
the
city's
throat of
throat.
the city.
It likes to think of itself as a liberal forward city, but it's actually one of the most segregated in the nation.
And at the time of this writing, 1960,
Very much so.
there was a lot going on, and Lowell was absolutely anti-segregation and pro-civil rights. We'll just state that for the record. Okay, so their monument sticks like a fishbone. So they've got this monument, and Shaw, who led the Negro Regiment, is a symbol of something that's a trouble to the city, and they've cordoned him off with pumpkin orange girders and fencing. So kind of an obvious symbol. He came upon this, Lowell did, and decided this was a symbol for the... So if you were a parking garage advocate, you might take exception to this logic connecting it to civil rights, wouldn't you? Is he, Lisa, is he playing a little fast and loose with the politics?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think that he's going deep into Boston's liberal pride and Boston's stiffness.
Yeah, right.
Its rigidity,
Puritanism.
its sanctimoniousness, its elegance,
We
and
invented abolitionism.
exactly. So, and the way Boston prides itself on its ideas and stays hunkered down in its New England.
And I assume that when you were talking about, what's the word, stature, rigidity, you were thinking about the poem. Because this statue, when he leads his black soldiers to death, he cannot bend his back.
Oh yeah, lean as a compass needle. This is all about rigidity and a kind of thinness of imagination and an aridity that goes to the
what does that
Saharan
mean though?
desert.
He cannot bend his back.
Well, he's stiff-backed, ideologically stiff-backed,
Okay, so not, okay.
right? He's not going to bend. He's an he's the son of an abolitionist, he's going to do this. But that becomes, Lisa, a way for Lowell cleverly to associate it with, he's a statue now. But
Right,
the
he's
statue
turned
is,
into a statue.
yes, and the
Which
statue...
is perfect for New Englanders. The best way to realize yourself is as a statue. And then, whereas
But who can
a
defeat him?
church on the thousand spot, what?
Who can defeat him? Well, the big dig is about to crumble him into he's being shaken. The one thing that can beat a statue is digging for a parking lot.
But it's the same. I mean, his sanctimonious, acquisitive vigilance and...
Now he's presiding over the big dig, in a way.
Yeah, he's presiding over the... I mean, in other Lowell poems, you see the way Boston idealism and Boston capitalism just run together.
And go ahead.
I was gonna just say quickly, I read like he cannot bend his back, and it's not literally his back, but he cannot, you can't return to the way it was. He can't lead his black shoulders to death. He cannot bend his regiment, his charge. So I read his his lot, I think I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Like, he cannot bend his lot back. That is his.
Yeah.
Didn't he volunteer his regiment for
And it was
the
and it
battle?
was futile in a way. I mean, he led his soldiers
And
into
they
a
mostly
massacre.
died. Yeah. Right. And then he himself died. So when you get to the next two stanzas, which I've identified as another section of the poem, and Lisa was pointing toward this a minute ago, we now have a much broader canvas. And Lowell is he's really widening this out. And this is a risky move because the poem has been so particular so far. But this is the thing about New England.
Sparse.
On 1,000 small town New England greens. In other words, this is playing out everywhere, right? The old white churches hold their air of sparse, sincere rebellion. Frayed flags quilt the graveyards of the grand army of the Republic. The stone statues of the abstract Union soldier grow slimmer and younger each year, wasp-waisted. They doze over muskets and muse through their sideburns. Okay, so first somebody talk about this strategy, this widening out. How's that working? Susan, what's happening there?
Well, he's talking about all of the towns around New England and how they embody the memory of this time in a statue, as Boston does.
And the Grand Army of the Republic? Which is that?
Union Army.
That's the Union Army. Okay, so these are greens set up with statues commemorating the people from those little towns who fought for the North.
And it's not just Boston's and it's not just Boston. It's been mythologized and spread.
Yep. So that's what's happening. And describe them: sparse, sincere rebellion. What kind of defense of the Union was that? Sparse, sincere. Anna? Sparse, sincere rebellion. What kind of rebellion is that?
I mean, my take of the last couple lines describing Colonel Shaw's memorial and the other imagined memorials of these small New England towns is still so often the case. There's a lot more celebration of like the white commanders than there is of the black soldiers. And there's a much more emphasis, much more interest in the figure of Colonel Shaw than there is in the people who made up his regiment. So that to me gets to that sparse, sincere rebellion. There's very, very few monuments to black soldiers of the Civil War. There are many more monuments.
So when you say is it sparsely sincere, you're talking about their attitude toward defeating the Confederacy and freeing people who were slaves, yes?
That and
so the
commitment to the aftermath of what was really required to actually handle Reconstruction in a way that would have accelerated civil rights instead of delaying it for 100 years.
Good. And the
150 years.
Flags are frayed and things are kind of worn. Then the stone statues of the abstract Union soldiers, so each village had a general, essentially unknown soldier, right? And that they ironically grow slimmer and younger. Why?
Because the rest of us
is getting older.
Well, that's true, but also because they're wearing down. Right? And
idealization.
Wasp Waisted is a funny line. For those of us who've studied the culture of the 1950s, what's that refer to?
More refers to women than men. Women.
Absolutely, but it's a very specific reference.
Corsets.
Yes.
That was the beauty ideal.
Wasp is an allegory of white people.
White Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, that's buried in there. We haven't gotten to the first level meaning. We went to the second level meaning. Wasp Waisted was an actual description of the ideal, really housewifery figure, the figure of the woman waiting at home when the businessman is in the gray flannel suit has done his day's work, and there is waiting for him, and the style, the actual design of dresses wasp waisted. So that's thrown in there. And ironically, the unknown soldiers have become wasp waisted. So they're sort of suburbanized, or tranquilized 50s. And then wasps.
Or minimized as females, not even men anymore, quote unquote.
And they doze over their muskets, so they're not exactly ready to get back into the fight. And then he uses an ellipsis. Because next, what do we get? The rest of the poem, so I'm going to read it, and it goes everywhere. So it's like a summation of all the time signatures. Shaw's father wanted no monument except the ditch. What's that mean?
Garages.
Where he died.
Was buried.
Yeah.
They dumped him into the hole
With
with all the others.
Father said he needs to be buried with his men,
Yeah.
right? Sergei went to the third meaning. Your middle name is third meaning. Meaning Shaw's father wanted no monument except for the parking garage, because that's it. The ditch is the big dig. Where his son's body was thrown and lost with his N-word, the ditch is nearer. Okay, well, that is a Lowellian move. What's he doing there? The ditch is nearer.
The ditch was the place where the battle actually happened and they actually died, and they couldn't do that. I don't remember where it was, but they couldn't do it, and the Gaudens Memorial couldn't go to where the 54th was massacred. So politically it had to be in Boston.
Right.
The ditch is nearer is just simply the death. It's coming soon.
But it's
The grave.
nuclear.
The grave is nearer.
It's nuclear war.
We're getting to nuclear war. You guys are so good at this. Why am I being the slow one here? In the first level, the ditch is nearer is a turn back toward the dig, right? So there is the ditch of what happened in the South during the war, and then the ditch is nearer. As Edith is reminding us, that's where it needed to be, but the ditch is also the dig. And nearer is a historical thing. Nearer is an ideological thing, meaning what's happening in Boston now, that is nearer. And that's all this civil rights stuff and the atomic bomb. Okay, there are no statues for the last war here. What's the last war?
World War II.
60.
Korea.
The Second World War. Well, yes, technically the Korean War, but that's not what he means. He means the Second World War. We know he does because he refers to Hiroshima. Why are there no statues for World War II? I'm not really asking you that, but it's a curiosity.
Because it was not in the mainland. It was fought, in different continents.
Because we're ashamed of what we did.
We have Korean War memorials too.
And of course many to World War II, but Lowell is pointing out something specific about Boston. There are no statues for the last war in 1960 for the 1939 to 45 war, for the United States 1941 to 45. On Boylston Street, a commercial photograph shows Hiroshima boiling over a Mosler Safe. Now there's a semicolon separating the statement that there are no statues to World War II, and then the semicolon, and then something there is. So what is he saying about the advertisement for the safe? What's he saying? Is he saying that that is the best we can do as a memorial for World War II? And what is it?
It's not part of the mythology, so it's only in the commercial stuff. It's not actually being commemorated.
And what is the commercial saying? It's a really offensive commercial.
That a Mosler Safe could survive.
Buy a Mosler Safe.
Rock of Ages.
The Rock of Ages safe.
Yeah.
Because it can survive a blast.
And why would they, Lisa was hinting about this in a minute ago, why would an advertiser in 1960 say, there's no monument to World War II, but, says Lowell, he's really smart about this, but we do have advertisements that tell everybody to buy stuff. You can protect what? Your Social Security card and the bonds, your U.S. savings bonds, and your precious photographs of your great-grandmother in the safe, because when we're all dead from the nuclear war, it'll still be there. This is Boston for him. A commercial photograph shows Hiroshima boiling over a Mosler Safe, the rock of ages that survived the blast. By the way, what kind of marketing and advertising is that? It seems like the Mosler Safe people had a safe in Hiroshima that survived, and now they're celebrating that?
Or they're just claiming it. They're just, making the claim.
It's a metaphor.
That we're so strong that we could survive this. Maybe it didn't actually survive Hiroshima.
Then, space is nearer. Help.
It's an opposition to the ditch is near.
The ditch is nearer.
It's a follow-up to the ditch is nearer. What's
Also,
being
the
said?
modern technology, the TV, brought the world closer.
So you mean space as in the distances between us?
Yeah.
But in 1960, what else does space mean?
Well, it was Kennedy.
Space race.
Yes, space race.
That was later though.
Glenn hadn't written yet, and Kennedy hadn't declared that we shall go to the moon yet.
Not yet.
But, oh yeah. Because what is it that's making us worried about the nuclear annihilation?
Watching it on TV.
Sputnik and all that.
The Soviet Union is making us think about space being nearer. The whole idea was if Sputnik is up there, then what? What could happen next?
They could take us over or something. The Russians would take over.
You were missing a few steps, but yes. If Sputnik is up there, the first thing people worried about was that it could carry some kind of nuclear device and come over us. And okay, space is nearer. And then we switch to the speaker again. It's been a little while since we've seen the speaker. When I crouch to my television set, the drained faces of Negro school children rise like balloons. All right, what's that?
They're in the buses in South Boston going to their schools.
Also segregation in general.
It's too early for the busing.
It's too early?
Too early, yeah.
Not busing in Boston.
It's the federal
the South.
segregation.
That was in the 70s.
Desegregation in
That's right.
schools and
That's
stuff.
right. But in the
Federally
South,
enforced desegregation
Yeah.
in the South. Probably this is, what's the first, 1957.
Yeah.
There's a series of them. It doesn't have to be a particular one. So there's Lowell crouching to watch his television set and sees what?
The drained faces of Negro school children. It's like balloons.
So they're unembodied, really. I mean, that's when you think of a balloon.
Why are they drained? Why are the faces drained?
Scared.
You've seen the images of children being escorted by, the federal troops into schools.
People were yelling at them, throwing things
Same
at
as
them.
the soldiers.
Frightened.
And what in the poem does this remind us of?
Same as the soldiers.
The soldiers, who were marched through Boston, by the way, on their way to the fish.
And the bubbles.
The fish.
Right.
And they're rising like balloons, Lisa?
Like the bubbles from the fish, from the noses of the couch-confined fish.
So he's back to that. Colonel Shaw is riding on his bubble. He waits for the blessed break. Some of you are shaking your heads.
I'm lost.
Yeah.
I am too, yeah.
That is the blessed.
Well, we know where riding on his bubble comes from. We just don't understand why Colonel Shaw would be riding on his bubble. He's riding on a horse, right? No, he's not. He's staying there with a musket. I don't think he's on a horse, is he?
But he always, that was his typical posture.
No, I think he is on a horse.
He is on a horse.
Yeah, the soldiers are not. They're-
Bobbo probably mean idealistic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And what is it that Lowell, as a child, kept wanting to do to those bubbles?
Burst them.
He waits. That's Shaw, not the speaker. Not Lowell as a child, but Shaw. But it might as well be the speaker. The break would be what?
Bursting of the bubbles.
Also breaking the lines.
Rest.
Breaking of the law.
Rest. Taking a break.
No, but it's blessed.
The break probably is a movement in the forward direction during this civil rights crisis. Then we get summary. The aquarium is gone. Everywhere, giant finned cars. I mean, it's hard not to laugh, but I think when people, he first read this in 1960 in public, in the Boston Common. He actually read it alongside Marianne Moore, who also read a poem at this public event. And I don't think they laughed.
Probably not.
No. So he's wagging his finger. So tell us what he's wagging his finger about. Everywhere giant finned cars nose forward like fish. A savage servility slides by on Greece. What's being said?
Well, I feel there's something implied in the poem about this time period in the 60s that's not being mentioned, which is the rise of capitalism, and what that relationship is with the history, the personal, and the city's history that he's addressing.
And what's he complaining about in this last image? What are giant finned cars?
Well, I think some of it's the commercialism, because with the TV, when more people getting TVs, they saw advertisements and cars were advertised. And so he sort of, the finned cars are sort of like, in this aquarium sort of.
The finned cars are the ones that make for aerodynamics.
Supposedly, yes. I think as usual, you guys have gone right past the obvious. Can we say what these finned cars were and what was the point?
They're very big cars, boat-like cars that guzzled gas and showed opulence of America, and America in the 50s, and we're prosperous.
And the finned cars were not actually aerodynamic?
But it was, yes.
But what was the idea?
Space age.
Space age. They were like rocket ships.
Right.
Yes, they were big, and especially from about 1954 to about 1962, the fins got bigger and bigger, and this is a ready analogy for him because he's thinking about the fish, right? Okay, so what's he complaining about?
But I think he's also contrasting the parade of cars with the parade of soldiers. Which is, if you look at that statue, it's 4 rows deep of soldiers, sort of parading in this noble.
But everything has declined, no? Because now it's conspicuous consumption cars, and why are they driving in the middle of this great city that should have better mass transit? Why? Why? Because they build all these parking lots. This is not an anti-parking lot poem, but it is. It's largely a poem that's saying, I am going to connect the thing that we do to our cities and the assumptions to a series of failed histories. That's a big thing he's trying to do. I'm not going to ask you whether it works or not, or maybe I can at the very end, but I'm still stuck on this last image. The aquarium is gone, but
the replacement for fish.
Right.
You don't need an aquarium. You've got Boston. And why do they nose? Why do cars nose around? Why don't they just rocket around? Traffic. It's an image of traffic. And he calls it a savage servility. And they slide by on grease, because of course cars are greasy.
But I feel like he's railing against time and what it does to history. But I take a little bit of umbrage because I feel like there's
against Lowell?
Well, it's a little bit of old money, treasuring its history in this great city, and the commoners. How does he refer to it in the first verse in comparison to fishes? What's that? I don't have my glasses on.
Half-foot scales?
No, he describes the people as like schools of fish, like commoners.
Are you sure?
No. What am I making up? I guess I made it up.
It's a new poem.
It's a new poem. But I feel like he's railing against the kind of change that has to do with you said it, conspicuous consumption. I like that term. And but also he's railing against commoners in a way. Commoners use the garage and commoners do this. I'm not saying he's doing that. I'm not saying anybody would agree. I take a little bit of umbrage. I feel that in the poem a bit, but that's probably retro.
Did he grow up right across the street, I think, from?
I thought it was Revere Street, on
91
Hill.
Revere
Beacon
Street.
Hill,
Yeah.
91, but on Beacon Hill.
Yeah,
So
on
I think
Beacon Hill.
So this was kind of
Big
like
money.
his backyard.
Sure.
But it was
Oh,
his
I guess
backyard,
it's
but-
possible that, and you're more Bostonian than I am by a long shot, but it's possible that he's one of those longtime Bostonians who's saying, gosh, it's this city, they should just leave it alone.
Right,
What was
yeah.
wrong with it? I think there's some of that. There's
Well,
some of
and I
that.
think
But he
what's
is taking a progressive view on civil rights, and this is his strategy.
Yes.
And it's a very risky strategy to say that the whole problem here is this impulse to build a garage, to become servile to gas guzzlers, to, advertise safes that can survive an atomic war. This is a conscientious objector. He didn't fight in World War II. Now, whatever you think of that conscientious objection, is complicated. He's psychologically a very complicated person. One has to respect that. That's quite a view. And one imagines his view of Hiroshima after being a CO.
I think there is a clash. There is a clash between the psychological desire of just people in general to live a normal life after all these world wars.
Right.
To have their beautiful American houses and their cars, and it's more than natural given the history. But then there is also, to me, this poem echoes with Revolt of the Masses, with Ortega's. He was a philosopher and he wrote the Revolt of the Masses, and he felt threatened by this. We understand where it's coming from, but it needs to be contained, otherwise
Counterculture.
everything will be wiped out by this consumerism and lack of taste. And
Interesting view. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I'm really interested in that point
Yeah,
of
it was
view
just
of Lowell.
my thing.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I don't think of Lowell and Ortega as occupying the same spot on the political spectrum, but
they're not, but they're echoing.
Jody?
So I see for some reason this reminds me of Heaney's digging, so like this digging in a way is kind of a metaphor, and what he uncovers, or what the disembodied, I guess, diggers seem to uncover at the end is when I look at the phrase savage servility, like I can't help but think of slavery. Like even though it was ostensibly abolished, it's still like the impulse behind it still lives on now, and Greece is the new colony.
That's good.
I want to collect a couple of final thoughts. It's not possible for everyone to have a final thought, but a few. I would like to invite Lisa in a minute to offer her final thought on this, and I will do the same. But let's collect one other. Gail, what is your final thought? Sorry to just spring it on you.
Right. Well, the end of the poem, coming back to the aquarium, then when I go back to the beginning of the poem and read about the aquarium again, it leads me in a different place, because he's talking about, this bubble that he wants to burst, that we're living in with these, with our bad values, and so now, he wants to burst the bubbles on the fish, who are us. We're the count-compliant fish. And he isn't sighing in nostalgia for the dark downward and vegetating kingdom. He thinks that we are sinking downward into darkness. So it really changes the beginning of the poem.
Wow.
This is complicated, because if he's concerned and upset and critical of our sinking downward into darkness, then why does he remember it so nostalgically at the beginning? Because he himself is very attracted to going downward. into
It's
darkness.
that double-sided. Is he? I read it optimistically first. Now I'm not so sure. Is he ambivalent about it?
Very good. Thank you for coming up with such a nice thing without warning. Lisa, you had a minute warning. Do you have a final thought on this?
I've read this poem so many times, and Lowell seems to me such a messed up genius. You know, it's easy for him to throw darts and burst bubbles at his own people, at the sanctimony of Boston. It's hard for me, the more and more I read him, to feel wisdom in this poet. And I think as I get older, I actually look for synthesis and some wisdom, and instead he seems a perpetually adolescent struggler, which is not bad. But you know, his purism at the end, the savage servility slides by on Greece, is no different from the wasp-waisted hardness of what he's critiquing. And so he seems to me a poet who doesn't offer us wisdom, but is like documentary bounty. I love the documentary crunch of Lowell. And as a person who now lives in Boston, just a few blocks off Boylston Street, I love it. We're just a few blocks off Boylston. Right.
This is what you call an on-location video.
Right between Boylston.
Yeah.
Just go straight down.
My final thought is really not nearly as synthetic and summarizing as the previous two, so thank you both. Mine is more of a footnote. I have always had trouble with the statement that there are no statues for the last war here. He uses here, and so it's a little hard to dispute because only he knows what he means by here. But by 1960, there was a great deal of thinking about what happened in World War II. And 1960, in fact, was a turning point in consciousness, not just about the war, but about the atomic bombs, the decision to drop the atomic bomb, and of course the Holocaust. So I have always resented this characterization in this part. It's sort of following Lisa's idea that he has these easy targets. It's very easy to go from saying there's no proper commemoration of the death of 22 million people in World War II or whatever here, and I am not going to be able to connect it to what happened in the American Civil War. Too bad, semicolon, but advertisers are jerks. That's a non sequitur. And the advertisers are jerks, and instead of being on his side and saying, yeah, they should not fool around with the memory of Hiroshima to sell safes, instead of being on his side, I'm mad at him for using that as his trump card. So he's lost me there. And then when he crouches to watch the television set, I wish he would just watch the television set and not have to crouch. He was a very big, gangly person who was not doing well psychologically. His mental health in 1960 was very messed up. So he's crouching to see the little faces of the school children, and there's an unintentional condescension there. And they're like the little fish, and he wants to bust the bubbles, and he's got tangled in his own nostalgia for the Boston Aquarium. You want to say to him, hey, bub, things change, you know. And, by the way, you probably ride around in a big car a lot.
With fishtails.
Thank you all. I thought you were...
If you want the angst of Blue Blood.
Here it is. You've got it. You've got it.
You know, the angst of Blue Blood with kind of genius firing. Here it is.
Yes.
And, you know, one question about this, because the title suggests, is that, what kind of commemoration of the dead is this? This is dedicated, in a sense, for the Union dead. Well, Anna, There's such a sigh over here that I think you get the phone.
Oh no, absolutely.
I think we have to ask ourselves. Okay, I think we have to ask ourselves the question when we think of Robert Lowell. This is right in the middle of his so-called confessional period. What kind of confession is this? If you're going to confess your own problems or complexities, it's probably best not to make an analogy to geopolitical things that are very important. I think Sylvia Plath tried to constrain herself. She didn't always succeed. Talk about the Holocaust, she kept putting that in there. But he doesn't restrain himself here. I think he felt he was doing, he had a civic purpose. And we're not so sure. Thank you all. This was great. You did such great. Give yourselves a big hand.